Before he was the man who saved the Union, he was selling firewood on a street corner in St. Louis. He was a West Point graduate and decorated war veteran reduced to poverty, a forgotten man with slumped shoulders and the look of disappointment in his eyes. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. This is the story of how America's greatest failure became its greatest hero. It's a story of redemption, forged not in a church but on the battlefield. How the fires of civil war burned away a decade of failure to reveal the granite core of a man the world had long dismissed. What did the crisis of the Civil War see in this quiet man that the rest of the world had missed? His story begins not with a bang, but with a quiet ordinariness. Hiram Ulysses Grant was born in a small two-room cabin in Point Pleasant, Ohio, in 1822. His father, Jesse Root Grant, was a loud, ambitious, and often domineering man who owned a successful tannery. Young Ulysses was the opposite of his father. He was shy, sensitive, and reserved. He hated the tannery, loathing the sight of blood and the brutal work of scraping hides. What he loved was horses. From a very young age, he displayed an almost mystical connection with them. He was a phenomenal horseman, known throughout the county for his ability to tame and ride even the most unruly animals. It was his one universally recognized talent. This quiet boy, who struggled to look people in the eye, became a figure of grace and command the moment he was on horseback. It was an early glimpse of the man he would become, but only when he was in his true element. He had no grand ambitions for a military career, but his father, Jesse, did. Seeing an opportunity for a free, prestigious education for his son, Jesse secured him an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. It was here that a clerical error would change his name forever. The congressman who nominated him mistakenly wrote his name as Ulysses S. Grant. When he arrived and tried to correct the error, the Academy's bureaucracy was unbending. Rather than fight, the quiet young man simply accepted it. Hiram Ulysses Grant was gone. In his place was U.S. Grant, a name his new classmates would soon turn into a nickname, Uncle Sam, or simply Sam. His time at West Point was unremarkable. He was a mediocre student, excelling in mathematics but struggling with military discipline and the rigid formalities of Army life. He graduated 21st in a class of 39 with no expectation of a brilliant career. He was assigned to the infantry, a deep disappointment for the master horseman who had dreamed of joining the cavalry. He planned to serve his mandatory term and then resign to become a math professor. But once again, history intervened. In 1846, the United States went to war with Mexico. Grant, like many young officers, was sent to the front. He served under two of the nation's top generals, Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, and he learned invaluable lessons by watching them. He saw combat, displayed remarkable bravery under fire, and learned the practical, brutal business of logistics, supply, and leading men in battle. But the experience also forged a deep and abiding hatred of war in his soul. He privately believed the conflict was a monstrous act of aggression, a powerful nation bullying a weaker one to seize its land for the expansion of slavery. He wrote later in his memoirs, "I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. This moral conviction, this quiet sense of right and wrong, would stay with him for the rest of his life." It was also during this period that he fell deeply in love. He was stationed near St. Louis, where he met Julia Dent, the sister of a West Point classmate. She was vivacious, intelligent, and completely devoted to the shy, quiet officer. For a man so often adrift, Julia became his anchor. Their love was the one unwavering constant in the turbulent decades to come. They were married in 1848, after the war ended, ready to begin a life together in the peacetime army. And that is when the failures began. The peacetime army was a terrible fit for Grant. He was assigned to a series of remote, desolate posts on the Pacific coast, first in California, then in the Oregon Territory. To get there, he had to leave his pregnant wife, Julia, behind, a separation that tormented him. He was a devoted family man trapped in a lonely, isolated world of boredom and routine. The man who thrived on action and purpose was now withering in a world that had none. He was desperately lonely and fell into a deep depression. It was during this time that rumors about his drinking began to surface. Grant was not a habitual drunkard, but he could not handle alcohol well. Even small amounts could make him visibly intoxicated. In the crushing loneliness of the frontier, he sometimes sought solace in the bottle. In 1854, his commanding officer allegedly gave him an ultimatum: resign your commission or face a court-martial. Humiliated, Ulysses S. Grant, a 32-year-old captain, left the only profession he had ever known in disgrace. He returned to his family in Missouri, determined to make a new life as a civilian. This next chapter would be even more difficult. Julia's father had given them a patch of land, and Grant, with his own hands, built a rough 2-story log cabin for his family. He named the farm Hardscrabble, a name that perfectly captured the reality of their lives. He worked the fields himself, clearing timber and planting crops, but he was not a good farmer. He struggled year after year, falling deeper into debt. He finally gave up on the farm and moved his family into St. Louis. He tried to start a real estate business, but it failed. He worked as a rent collector, a job he hated. And then came the ultimate humiliation for a West Point graduate. Selling firewood on the street corners of the city, his old army coat his only protection against the cold. He was a good and decent man, a hard worker, but he lacked the aggression, the salesmanship, the very knack for business that defined the American spirit of the age. He was too trusting, too honest, and too quiet. Finally, in 1860, having failed at everything he had tried, he swallowed his pride and accepted a final offer of help. His father offered him a job as a clerk in the family's leather goods store in the small river town of Galena, Illinois. So at the age of 38, Ulysses S. Grant moved his family once more. He worked for his younger brother, keeping the books and measuring hides for $50 a month. To the townspeople of Galena, he was a quiet, unassuming man, known only as the brother of the successful Mr. Grant. He seemed destined to live out his days in quiet obscurity, a man whose early promise had dissolved into a life of profound and settled failure. But in April of 1861, a cannon shot was fired at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Civil War had begun. President Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. And across the North, towns and cities exploded in a patriotic frenzy. In the quiet town of Galena, a town meeting was held to raise a company of volunteers. The townspeople needed someone with military experience to lead them, to drill them, to turn them into soldiers. They looked around the room, and their eyes settled on the quiet clerk from the leather store. They knew he was a West Point man, a veteran. They asked him to preside over the meeting. Ulysses S. Grant, the man who had known only failure for a decade, who had left the army in disgrace, walked to the front of the room. As he stood there, something shifted. The quiet clerk was gone. In his place stood Captain Grant, a man with a purpose. For the first time in a decade, he was finally back in his element. As the nation fractured, something within Grant began to mend. The war that would tear America apart was the one event that could finally make him whole. When the Civil War began, the Union was in desperate need of trained military leaders. Yet the man who would ultimately save it was, at first, an afterthought. After drilling the Galena volunteers and marching them to the state capitol in Springfield, Illinois, Ulysses S. Grant found himself a man without a command. He wrote a letter to the War Department in Washington, respectfully offering his services, detailing his West Point education and his experience in the Mexican War. The letter was never answered. It was likely lost in a pile, unopened. He was not an impressive figure in person. He was short, slightly stooped, and spoke in a soft, almost hesitant voice. He lacked the political polish and grandiloquent swagger of the political generals who were flocking to Washington, using their connections to secure high command. Grant had no connections. For weeks he languished in Springfield, working as a clerk for the state's adjutant general, a job barely above a bookkeeper. It seemed his return to military life would be as frustrating as his civilian career. But then a difficult problem arose. The 21st Illinois Infantry was a notoriously unruly and undisciplined regiment, and its commander had resigned in frustration. The state governor, needing someone to bring them under control, looked around and saw the quiet, 39-year-old former captain. He offered Grant the command. When Colonel Grant first appeared before his new regiment, the soldiers were unimpressed. They saw a man in a shabby civilian coat, not a dashing commander. But then he spoke. His words were not fancy or inspiring, just simple, direct commands. He drilled them relentlessly, imposing a quiet but unyielding discipline. The rowdy regiment was transformed. Within weeks, they were an effective fighting unit. It was the first sign of the Grant method. No flash, no drama, just a quiet, implacable focus on the task at hand. His first real test came that autumn. Now a brigadier general, he was given command of a small Union force in southern Illinois. From his headquarters in Cairo, he saw an opportunity. In November 1861, he led a daring amphibious raid against a Confederate camp at Belmont, Missouri. The battle itself was a messy, inconclusive affair, and Grant's little army was almost cut off and destroyed. But they fought their way out. The battle taught Grant a crucial lesson. He could stay cool under fire. More importantly, it showed his men and himself that he was not afraid to fight. While other Union generals in the war's early stages were known for their caution and endless preparation, Grant had a simple, brutal clarity about his purpose. The art of war is simple enough, he would later write. Find out where your enemy is. Get at him as soon as you can. Strike him as hard as you can and keep moving on. It was this philosophy that would soon propel him to national fame. His moment came in the winter of 1862. The Confederacy's main defensive line in the West was anchored by two key forts in Tennessee, Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. These forts were the gateway to the Confederate heartland. Grant saw their strategic importance and, after much pleading, convinced his superior to let him attack. In February, in a brilliantly coordinated joint operation with the U.S. Navy's ironclad gunboats, he captured Fort Henry with ease. He then immediately marched his army 12 miles overland through freezing mud and rain to lay siege to the much stronger Fort Donelson. The fighting was fierce, and the winter weather was brutal, but Grant was relentless. When the Confederate commander, an old friend from his army days, asked for terms of surrender, Grant's reply was blunt, direct, and would become the stuff of legend. He wrote, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." The Confederate force of nearly 15,000 men surrendered. It was the Union's first major victory of the war. It cracked the Confederate defensive line wide open and forced them to abandon Kentucky and much of Tennessee. Overnight, the obscure general from Illinois became a national hero. Newspapers, playing on his initials, U.S., dubbed him unconditional surrender, Grant. President Lincoln, overjoyed to have found a general who would actually fight, promoted him to Major General. But the joy of victory was short-lived. Just 2 months later, Grant would face his greatest trial by fire, a battle that would nearly destroy his career. As he pushed his army deeper into Tennessee, he gathered his forces near a small country church named Shiloh. He was waiting for reinforcements before moving on the key rail center of Corinth, Mississippi. But the Confederate commander, Albert Sidney Johnston, decided to attack first. At dawn on April 6, 1862, tens of thousands of Confederate soldiers burst out of the woods and slammed into Grant's unprepared camps. It was a complete surprise. The Union lines buckled and broke. For the entire day, a savage, chaotic battle raged through the woods and fields around Shiloh Church. It was some of the most brutal fighting the war had yet seen. Grant, who was miles away when the battle began, raced to the front. He was everywhere, rallying his shattered divisions, forming new lines of defense, a figure of absolute calm in a hurricane of death and confusion. By nightfall, his army had been pushed back 2 miles, but it had not broken. That night, a torrential rainstorm broke over the battlefield. Under a dripping oak tree, one of his subordinate generals, William Tecumseh Sherman, found Grant, his face grim. "Well, Grant," Sherman said, "we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" Grant, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, took a slow pull from his cigar and let the smoke curl into the damp night air. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "we'll lick 'em tomorrow, though." While others saw a catastrophic defeat, Grant saw an opportunity. He knew the enemy was just as battered and exhausted as his own men. With the arrival of his reinforcements overnight, he ordered a massive counterattack at dawn. The next day, he drove the Confederates from the field. Shiloh was a Union victory, but it came at a staggering price. In 2 days, there were over 23,000 casualties, more than in all of America's previous wars combined. The nation was horrified by the carnage. Grant was widely blamed for being taken by surprise, and the criticism against him was fierce and unrelenting. Politicians and newspapers called for his removal, but President Lincoln, who was beginning to understand the unique quality of this quiet general, stood by him. When a delegation came to the White House demanding Grant's dismissal, Lincoln delivered one of his most famous lines. "I can't spare this man," he told them. "He fights." Lincoln's faith was soon vindicated. Grant was given a new, even more daunting objective: to capture the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg was a fortress city, perched on high bluffs overlooking a hairpin turn in the Mississippi River. It was called the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. Its powerful cannons controlled the river, splitting the Union in two and allowing the western states of the Confederacy to continue supplying the East. Lincoln knew that Vicksburg was the key. "Vicksburg is the nail that holds the South's two halves together," he said. For months, Grant tried and failed to take the city. He tried digging canals. He tried amphibious assaults through the swampy bayous. Nothing worked. By the spring of 1863, his campaign was bogged down, and the calls for his removal began again. It was then, in his darkest hour, that he conceived one of the most brilliant and audacious campaigns in military history. He decided to do the unthinkable. He would march his army down the opposite side of the river, cross it south of Vicksburg, and attack the city from the rear, from the east, where it was least defended. To do this, he would have to cut himself off entirely from his supply lines, living off the land in hostile territory. It was a gamble that violated every military textbook. Even his most trusted subordinate, Sherman, thought it was madness. But Grant had a quiet confidence in his plan and in the ability of his men. In a daring nighttime operation, the U.S. Navy's ironclad fleet ran past the Vicksburg cannons to meet Grant's army south of the city. Once across the river, Grant's army became a thunderbolt. For 3 weeks, they marched 180 miles, fought and won 5 separate battles against 2 different Confederate armies, and drove the enemy back into the Vicksburg defenses. It was a masterpiece of speed, deception, and relentless aggression. He then laid siege to the city. For 47 days, the Union Army and Navy bombarded Vicksburg around the clock. Inside the city, soldiers and civilians alike were starved into submission, forced to live in caves and eat mules and rats. Finally, on July 4, 1863, the Confederate Army surrendered. On that day, the Union flag was raised over the fortress city. The Mississippi River was now a Union highway. The Confederacy had been torn in two. The victory at Vicksburg, coming just 1 day after the great Union victory at Gettysburg in the East, was the turning point of the Civil War, and it was Grant's masterpiece. He was no longer just a tenacious brawler. He had proven himself to be a strategic genius of the first order. That fall, he was sent to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where he broke another Confederate siege in a spectacular victory at the Battle of Missionary Ridge. Now there was no question. The failed clerk from Galena had become the Union's indispensable man. In March 1864, a grateful Abraham Lincoln summoned him to Washington. He promoted him to the rank of lieutenant general, a rank not held by anyone since George Washington, and gave him command of all the armies of the United States. His final mission was now clear. He would go east to Virginia to personally direct the war against the Confederacy's greatest and most legendary warrior, General Robert E. Lee. The stage was set for the final brutal, bloody chapter of the American Civil War. In the spring of 1864, a new and terrible chapter of the Civil War began. For 3 years, the Union's mighty Army of the Potomac had been locked in a bloody stalemate with the Confederacy's legendary Army of Northern Virginia, led by the seemingly invincible Robert E. Lee. One Union general after another had tried and failed to destroy Lee, each one outmaneuvered, outfought, and sent reeling back to Washington in defeat. The war in the East had become a source of profound frustration and despair for the Union. Now a new commander had arrived from the West. Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant was not like the generals who had come before him. He was not handsome or dashing. He did not issue grand Napoleonic proclamations. He was a quiet, rumpled man who chewed constantly on a cigar and wore a private, simple uniform with only the stars of his rank on the shoulder. But Abraham Lincoln had given him one simple instruction: find Lee and crush him. Grant understood something that his predecessors had not. He knew that Robert E. Lee was more than just a general. He was the living embodiment of the Confederacy. To defeat the Confederacy, he had to destroy Lee's army, and he knew that Lee was a master of defense and maneuver. To beat him, Grant would have to change the very nature of the war. He would not play Lee's game of elegant tactical chess. He would turn the war into a grim, relentless, brutal contest of attrition. In 1854, his commanding officer allegedly gave him an ultimatum: resign your commission or face a court-martial. Humiliated, Ulysses S. Grant, a 32-year-old captain, left the only profession he had ever known in disgrace. He returned to his family in Missouri, determined to make a new life as a civilian. This next chapter would be even more difficult. Julia's father had given them a patch of land, and Grant, with his own hands, built a rough 2-story log cabin for his family. He named the farm Hardscrabble, a name that perfectly captured the reality of their lives. He worked the fields himself, clearing timber and planting crops, but he was not a good farmer. He struggled year after year, falling deeper into debt. He finally gave up on the farm and moved his family into St. Louis. He tried to start a real estate business, but it failed. He worked as a rent collector, a job he hated. And then came the ultimate humiliation for a West Point graduate. Selling firewood on the street corners of the city, his old army coat his only protection against the cold. He was a good and decent man, a hard worker, but he lacked the aggression, the salesmanship, the very knack for business that defined the American spirit of the age. He was too trusting, too honest, and too quiet. Finally, in 1860, having failed at everything he had tried, he swallowed his pride and accepted a final offer of help. His father offered him a job as a clerk in the family's leather goods store in the small river town of Galena, Illinois. So at the age of 38, Ulysses S. Grant moved his family once more. He worked for his younger brother, keeping the books and measuring hides for $50 a month. To the townspeople of Galena, he was a quiet, unassuming man, known only as the brother of the successful Mr. Grant. He seemed destined to live out his days in quiet obscurity, a man whose early promise had dissolved into a life of profound and settled failure. But in April of 1861, a cannon shot was fired at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Civil War had begun. President Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. And across the North, towns and cities exploded in a patriotic frenzy. In the quiet town of Galena, a town meeting was held to raise a company of volunteers. The townspeople needed someone with military experience to lead them, to drill them, to turn them into soldiers. They looked around the room, and their eyes settled on the quiet clerk from the leather store. They knew he was a West Point man, a veteran. They asked him to preside over the meeting. Ulysses S. Grant, the man who had known only failure for a decade, who had left the army in disgrace, walked to the front of the room. As he stood there, something shifted. The quiet clerk was gone. In his place stood Captain Grant, a man with a purpose. For the first time in a decade, he was finally back in his element. As the nation fractured, something within Grant began to mend. The war that would tear America apart was the one event that could finally make him whole. When the Civil War began, the Union was in desperate need of trained military leaders. Yet the man who would ultimately save it was, at first, an afterthought. After drilling the Galena volunteers and marching them to the state capitol in Springfield, Illinois, Ulysses S. Grant found himself a man without a command. He wrote a letter to the War Department in Washington, respectfully offering his services, detailing his West Point education and his experience in the Mexican War. The letter was never answered. It was likely lost in a pile, unopened. He was not an impressive figure in person. He was short, slightly stooped, and spoke in a soft, almost hesitant voice. He lacked the political polish and grandiloquent swagger of the political generals who were flocking to Washington, using their connections to secure high command. Grant had no connections. For weeks he languished in Springfield, working as a clerk for the state's adjutant general, a job barely above a bookkeeper. It seemed his return to military life would be as frustrating as his civilian career. But then a difficult problem arose. The 21st Illinois Infantry was a notoriously unruly and undisciplined regiment, and its commander had resigned in frustration. The state governor, needing someone to bring them under control, looked around and saw the quiet, 39-year-old former captain. He offered Grant the command. When Colonel Grant first appeared before his new regiment, the soldiers were unimpressed. They saw a man in a shabby civilian coat, not a dashing commander. But then he spoke. His words were not fancy or inspiring, just simple, direct commands. He drilled them relentlessly, imposing a quiet but unyielding discipline. The rowdy regiment was transformed. Within weeks, they were an effective fighting unit. It was a futile attack that Grant would regret for the rest of his life. "I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made," he wrote in his memoirs. In just 1 month of fighting, Grant's army had suffered over 50,000 casualties, a number nearly as large as Lee's entire army. He had failed to destroy Lee. He had failed to capture Richmond. By any conventional measure, the campaign had been a catastrophic failure, and yet in a strategic sense, it had been a stunning success. He had done what no other Union general had been able to do. He had latched onto Robert E. Lee's army and had not let go. He had pinned Lee down and was systematically bleeding his army to death. Now, Grant made his most brilliant strategic move of the campaign. He secretly disengaged his entire army from the front at Cold Harbor, and in a masterful feat of engineering and logistics, marched them south and crossed the massive James River on a hastily constructed pontoon bridge over 2,000 feet long. His new target was not Richmond, but the crucial railroad hub of Petersburg, south of the capital. If he could capture Petersburg, he could cut off all the supply lines to Richmond and Lee's army and starve them into surrender. But a series of blunders by his subordinates allowed a small Confederate force to hold the Petersburg defenses just long enough for Lee's army to arrive. The opportunity for a quick victory was lost, and so began the longest and most grueling siege of the war. For the next 10 months, from the summer of 1864 to the spring of 1865, the two armies faced each other from a vast, complex network of trenches that stretched for nearly 30 miles around Petersburg. The nature of war had changed. Gone were the open fields and grand maneuvers. Now two armies faced each other from a hellish, sprawling network of trenches, and the conflict became a miserable daily grind of mud, disease, and random death. The soldiers lived like rats in the earth, enduring the searing heat of summer, the freezing mud of winter, and the constant random death of sniper fire and artillery shells. The war became a slow, grinding, and miserable affair. As the siege dragged on, Grant's grand strategy was bearing fruit elsewhere. In the fall of 1864, Sherman captured Atlanta, a victory that helped secure Abraham Lincoln's re-election. Then, Sherman began his famous March to the Sea, cutting a 60-mile-wide swath of destruction across Georgia, destroying the Confederacy's economic and psychological ability to wage war. By the spring of 1865, Lee's army in the trenches around Petersburg was at the breaking point. His soldiers were starving, exhausted, and deserting in droves. On April 2nd, Grant finally ordered a massive assault that broke through the Confederate lines. Petersburg fell. The Confederate government abandoned Richmond. Lee's ragged, starving army was forced to flee west, with Grant's victorious forces in relentless pursuit. The chase lasted for a week. Finally, on April 9th, 1865, at a small crossroads village called Appomattox Courthouse, Lee's army, now surrounded and with no hope of escape, was forced to surrender. The two great generals met in the parlor of a private home to discuss the terms. Grant, in his muddy field uniform, was magnanimous in victory. He offered terms that were simple and generous. The Confederate soldiers would be paroled and allowed to go home. He allowed them to keep their horses and sidearms. When his own soldiers began to fire celebratory cannon salutes, Grant ordered them to stop. "The war is over," he told his staff. "The rebels are our countrymen again." He looked at the defeated rebels not as enemies, but as countrymen. The generosity he offered surprised everyone. The general who had prosecuted the war with such brutal resolve was now the first to begin the work of reconciliation. In the spring of 1865, Ulysses S. Grant was the savior of the Union. He was more than a general. He was a symbol of the nation's resilience, the quiet, determined man who had brought the long, bloody nightmare of the Civil War to an end. He was, after the martyred Abraham Lincoln, the most beloved and revered man in America. He wanted nothing more than to return to a quiet life with his wife and family, but the chaos of peace would prove to be almost as treacherous as the chaos of war. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The nation, still celebrating the end of the war, was plunged into grief and confusion. Vice President Andrew Johnson, a pro-Union Democrat from Tennessee, was now president, and he was immediately locked in a bitter struggle with the radical Republicans in Congress over the future of the South and the rights of the newly freed African Americans. Grant, the soldier who hated politics, was thrust into the center of this storm. President Johnson tried to use Grant's immense popularity to support his own lenient Reconstruction policy, which allowed former Confederate leaders to quickly regain power and impose brutal black codes to control the freedmen. But as Grant toured the South, he was horrified by what he saw: the unrepentant arrogance of former rebels and the violent persecution of black citizens. His simple sense of justice was offended. He gradually broke with Johnson and aligned himself with the Republicans in Congress, who were fighting to protect the civil rights that had been won at such a terrible cost. By 1868, the country was tired of the political warfare in Washington. The Republican Party, needing a hero to unite the nation, turned to the one man everyone trusted. Grant accepted the presidential nomination not out of ambition, but out of a sense of duty. He ran on a simple, heartfelt slogan that captured his deepest desire for the country: "Let us have peace." He won the election in a landslide. The failed tanner from Galena was now the President of the United States. His presidency is one of the most misunderstood in American history, often dismissed as a complete failure plagued by corruption. The reality is far more complex. In his first term, President Grant proved to be a surprisingly forceful and effective champion of civil rights. His greatest and most courageous achievement was his war against the first Ku Klux Klan. In the late 1860s, the KKK had emerged as a violent terrorist organization, murdering and intimidating black voters and their white allies across the South to restore white supremacy. Grant, horrified by the violence, declared the Klan a rebellion against the United States. He urged Congress to pass a series of tough new laws known as the Enforcement Acts, which gave him the power to use federal troops to suppress the Klan and protect the rights of African Americans. He then created the Department of Justice to prosecute Klansmen in federal court. In 1871, he declared martial law in 9 counties in South Carolina, sent in the army, and rounded up hundreds of Klan members. His decisive action effectively crushed the KKK for a generation. It was a remarkable, if temporary, victory for federal power and human rights. He also worked tirelessly to secure the ratification of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which guaranteed the right to vote for African American men. But the virtues that had made Grant a great general, his simple honesty, his loyalty to his friends, proved to be disastrous liabilities in the political world. He was a terrible judge of character. He filled his administration with a mix of able reformers and corrupt opportunists, and he was pathologically incapable of believing that the men he trusted could be crooks. As a result, his presidency was rocked by a series of devastating scandals. The Credit Mobilier scandal involved massive fraud in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, and it implicated his own vice president. The whiskey ring was a massive tax evasion scheme run by distillers and Treasury officials that reached deep into the White House itself. Grant himself was never personally corrupt. He took no bribes and died a poor man. His loyalty, a virtue on the battlefield, became his greatest weakness in the White House. He could not bring himself to believe that the men he trusted, men he considered friends, could be capable of such deceit. He defended them long after their guilt was plain to all. His loyalty to his friends, even when they were proven to be thieves, baffled the nation and permanently stained his administration's reputation. In his second term, the nation's mood began to shift. A massive financial crisis, the Panic of 1873, plunged the country into a deep economic depression. The focus of the public and the politicians shifted from civil rights in the South to economic problems in the North. The will to continue the difficult, expensive, and often violent work of Reconstruction began to fade. Grant's ability to enforce the rights of African Americans dwindled, and by the time he left office in 1877, the forces of white supremacy were once again on the rise in the South. After leaving the presidency, Grant and Julia embarked on a triumphant 2-year world tour. They were greeted as global celebrities, dining with Queen Victoria in England, meeting the Pope in Rome, and being hosted by the Emperor of Japan. It was a joyous and well-deserved final act on the world stage for the man who had saved his nation. He returned home still a beloved figure, but the quiet civilian life once again proved to be his undoing. He moved to New York City, and seeking to build a fortune for his family, he entered into a business partnership with a charismatic young Wall Street financier named Ferdinand Ward. Grant, ever trusting, invested all of his own money and his family's money into the firm, and his famous name attracted millions more from other investors. But Ferdinand Ward, the young Napoleon of finance, was a complete fraud. The firm was a massive Ponzi scheme. In 1884, the firm collapsed and the scheme was exposed. The scandal was a national sensation. Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of Appomattox, the 2-term president of the United States, was left utterly bankrupt and publicly humiliated. He was now over 60 years old and had lost everything. And then came the final, cruelest blow. At the same time as his financial ruin, he was diagnosed with excruciating, inoperable throat cancer. The doctors gave him less than a year to live. He was now facing poverty, humiliation, and a death sentence, all at the same time. It was in this darkest moment that the quiet, resilient man that had saved the Union at Shiloh and in the wilderness emerged for one final, heroic task. His sole motivation was to provide for his beloved Julia after he was gone. He began writing articles about his wartime experiences to earn a little money. It was then that the celebrated author Mark Twain came to him with a proposal. Twain, who deeply admired Grant, offered him an incredibly generous publishing deal to write his memoirs. And so Ulysses S. Grant began his last campaign. In constant agonizing pain, unable to speak above a whisper, he sat wrapped in blankets on the porch of a small cottage in upstate New York and began to write. Day after day, he filled small pads of paper with his clear, direct, and honest prose. He was in a desperate race against death. As the cancer consumed his throat, he wrote with a furious intensity, recalling the great battles and campaigns with a clarity and precision that astounded everyone. He finished the 2-volume manuscript just days before he died, on July 23, 1885. The Personal Memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant was an immediate and colossal success. It became one of the best-selling books of the 19th century, earning his family nearly $500,000 and securing their financial future. It is now considered by critics and historians alike to be a masterpiece, the single greatest military autobiography in American literature, a work of stunning honesty and quiet, understated power. In his final days, the man who had failed at farming, business, and judging politicians found two things at which he truly excelled: waging war and telling its story. He was not a flashy genius or a polished statesman, but a simple, decent man whose greatest virtues were his quiet determination and unshakable resilience. These were the qualities that saved the Union on the battlefield. And as he raced against death, these same virtues allowed him to win his last campaign with his memoirs, securing a final noble legacy far more lasting than any monument.